Hi, thanks for all of you for coming. I really appreciate your interest. My name is Dick Lavine. I'm the very senior fiscal analyst at the Center for Public Policy Priorities. And I just want to let Eva take a break and also explain to you why, if the economy's good and the jobless rate is low, how come there's not any money to write the state budget? It is a little bit because of oil and gas, and we know the effect it's had is specifically in Houston and other parts of the state, but it is mainly because of decisions the legislature made in 2015 and before that has really restricted the ability of the Appropriations Committee and the Finance Committee to write the budget that we need, because as the Comptroller said, normal revenue growth has been pre-dedicated. It's been sent other places, committed to other reasons, and not available to write the budget. So let's start with a little background of where does the money come from. This is where state revenue comes from for all funds. About half of it comes from taxes. About a third of it comes from federal funds. Ever showed you the one with the great big balloon for Medicaid. The lottery is that tiny slice around 10 o'clock. The only reason we pulled that out is because everybody always asks, how come we need to use property taxes and pay for public schools? I thought the lottery paid for public schools. And in fact, the lottery does pay for public schools. Not originally, but the legislature soon realized that was a public expectation. So now the net revenue from the lottery is dedicated to the foundation school program, and it's about $1 billion a year, and it pays for a little less than the first week of school. School funding is over $40 billion a year. The lottery goes there, but it doesn't make any difference. And in fact, it doesn't even add to the amount available for the schools. It's just some of the money comes from the lottery instead of coming from the foundation, from general revenue or someplace else. The next slide, we're talking about just the state general revenue sources, so not the federal funds or some of those other things. And you can see that of the half of the state revenue that comes from taxes, more than half of it comes from the sales tax. That's a big slice there. And next to it is the motor vehicle sales tax, which is technically separate, but is essentially a sales tax when you buy a car. So that's nearly 2/3 of revenue coming from essentially sales taxes. One problem is, of course, that goes up and down with the economy. And another thing they won't talk about in detail is the sales tax is hugely regressive. What that means is that it takes a much larger proportion of the income of a low or moderate or even middle income family than it does from an upper income family, because lower and middle income families spend everything that they've got just to keep their families going, but people at the top end can afford to do whatever their families need, plus have money left over for savings. Plus, if they spend the money, often it's spent on services, legal services, stockbrokers, real estate agents, accountants. None of those things are taxed by the sales tax, but they're used disproportionately by higher income families. So one of the big problems with our tax system is those who can least afford it pay the most. And this is why, because of the sales tax. Then as you look around 9 o'clock, you can see these are some of the business taxes. The oil and gas tax is paid by whoever owns the well based on what comes out of the ground. The franchise tax we'll talk about a bit in a minute. And the insurance tax. And then across the top, we have the lottery again, and the other odds and ends like the cigarette tax and alcohol taxes. But mainly, it's a sales tax-driven system. Now, let's look at the sales tax over time. And you can see it grows. Texas has been growing. The economy's been growing. And I hope you can see it, especially from the back. But we divided them into the two different bars. One is all funds, and one is GR related, general revenue related. And pretty much there wasn't any difference until recently. And you can see what happened is the all funds, the total sales tax collections, keeps going up. But the GR related, the part that the Appropriations Committee and the Finance Committee can decide what to do with, went flat. And this is a good time to explain what happened. This is something that the last legislature did and then sent to the voters because it required a constitutional amendment. What they said is once the sales tax reaches $28 billion a year, the next $2.5 billion goes straight to the highway fund, and then only if you get more than $30.5 billion, the 28 plus the 2.5, then the rest of it comes back to GR. And what's expected, according to the controller's revenue estimate, is we're not going to get to $30.5 billion. So the highway fund, in fact, is not even going to get the $5 billion they were hoping for. They're going to get a little bit less. But more importantly to what we're talking about is that means that there's essentially a cap on sales tax revenue. The source of most of state tax revenue, as I just pointed out, is being held flat at $28 billion for the next couple of years. That is a huge amount of money that's no longer available for the budget. And you can see in this slide what that means. The right-hand bar, the one that goes below zero, is the money that, the less revenue that's coming into general revenue. Half of that is the more or less $5 billion that's going to highways. Most of the rest of it, $2.6 billion, is the franchise tax cut. This is something that was passed last session. The franchise tax, also known as the margins tax, is a major tax that's paid only by business. It used to be essentially a corporate income tax. And in 2006, in response to the state Supreme Court opinion about school finance, it was changed. What they did in school finance is require all school districts to cut their M&O tax rate, their maintenance and operation tax rate for annual expenses, by a third. Most of the districts were at $1.50 per $100 of property value. They had to cut it to $1. So their property tax revenue was cut by a third. But the state said, don't worry, we'll take care of it. You will be no worse off because we'll give you extra state aid to make up what you're losing in property taxes. And then in order to fund that extra state aid, they raised the cigarette tax a bit, and they changed the old franchise tax into what's now called the margins tax. And the reason it's called the margins tax is it's based on the margin, or the difference, between gross receipts, everything that a business brings in, and either their cost of goods sold, what they buy and then they process or package or use in manufacturing, or their cost of compensation, what they pay their employees. They figured that difference between gross receipts and either cost of goods sold or compensation, and originally most companies paid 1% of that difference. What the legislature did last session is they cut that 1% to 0.75%. So they cut the money coming in from the franchise tax by a quarter. That's $2.6 billion we don't even see. It doesn't even get here. Unlike the sales tax, which gets here and then goes straight off to the highway fund before anybody can make any other decisions on it. Then on the left-hand bar are a few extra commitments that were taken on last session that means that much less is available for discretionary spending. Two parts of that. One is that DPS and the Department of Motor Vehicles used to be funded out of the highway fund. Now they're funded out of general revenue. So that's a commitment that's been made, and DPS in particular, of course, is now a lot bigger because of so-called border security expenditures. The other is the homestead exemption. Last session, the legislature proposed to the voters, had to be a constitutional amendment, and the voters approved an increase in the school property tax exemption. It's a statewide mandatory exemption. Everybody used to have a $15,000 exemption. It's now up to $25,000. That means if your house is, say, a $225,000 house, you don't pay taxes on that full $225,000. You pay taxes only on $200,000. We, in fact, were in favor of this at the time because since it did look like the legislature was looking for tax cuts, between the various things that were on the table, this looked best to us because it helps offset the regressivity that I mentioned. Because at least among homeowners, everybody gets, as it turns out, about $125 a piece, or at least gets a tax break worth $125 a piece. And obviously $125 makes a much more difference to a lower middle income family than it does to an upper income family. This is independent of what you may have been reading in the last couple of days, about the optional percentage homestead exemption that TEA is now recognizing as a cost for rich school districts. That kind of exemption is the opposite of this flat dollar amount. It's 20%. 20% of $1 million means you save $200,000 off the taxable value. 20% of a $200,000 home means only $40,000 off. So this is a relatively progressive thing, but it costs money. If you add up all these bars, the franchise tax cut, the diversion to the highway fund, the extra formerly funded by highway fund stuff GR now has to do, and the homestead exemption, plus at the bottom of the right-hand bar is a little $1 billion extra in tax cuts that passed in 2013, adds up to about $10 billion. And if you like numbers, here are the numbers. I'm not going to run through them all, but you can see it starts with how much money comes in. You set aside some for the highway fund. You add in the other sources. You have to set aside a little bit extra for the rainy day fund, and you have available a cash balance. Well, last session they came in with a cash balance of about $7.25 billion. This time when they're coming in, they have $1.5 billion, and as you know, there's always a supplemental appropriations bill to get us through the rest of the fiscal year. A lot of that's probably going to go to Medicaid. An extra $100 million of it is going to go to schools because of the decision TEA just made last week. So it is entirely possible that the supplemental appropriations will have to be even bigger than the cash on hand. So where are they going to get the money? Do we have that coming up? There's more numbers that I just told you about. This is where you can get the money. You can get the money from the rainy day fund. That's what it's for. The rainy day fund was established in the late 1980s when Texas was much more reliant on oil and gas, and oil prices totally collapsed. Now, one response of the legislature at the time was actually to raise taxes. The sales tax had only been 4%, and now it's up to 6.25%. And that happened in the 4 or 5 years after this price collapse. Gasoline tax went from 10 cents to 20 cents. So they took what I think a very reasonable response. If you need to maintain your services, you have to raise taxes to pay for them. But the other thing they did is they started to create a savings account. And the rainy day fund, it's actually known as the Economic Stabilization Fund. And the reason for this name is the idea is to stabilize the budget when you run into hard times in the economy. Or think of it as like filling in the potholes. You get a smooth course from one year to the next. And it's been used. You can see the I guess that's blue and red bar shows you, the red shows expenditures they've made. And they've made expenditures all the time for ongoing expenses. There is a feeling now it should only be used for one time. That's not the original intent. That's not how it's been used until the recent past. It's there, it's available, and it can help make up for all these decisions that the legislature made in the last session or two that have put such a squeeze on the budget. The other thing you can do, of course, is, and there's a provision to do this, just cancel that sales tax transfer to the highway fund. In fact, the Sunset Commission, I believe, has found that TxDOT's not able to cope with all the money that's flooding into it now. They can just take a year or two break. We can use the money to maintain funding for health and human services and public education and everything else we have to do, and then it can go back to the highway fund. So there's the rainy day fund, there's postponing the sales tax diversion, there's things we can do to avoid the totally harmful cuts that Eva started to outline. I think we have one more slide with more details about how the rainy day fund has been used in the past. But, last slide before Eva gets to stand up again. This is just a step back. We've been talking only about the state budget so far. Now we're going to talk about all state and local spending and where the money comes from. And you can see that the state is a highly sales tax dependent government. But overall, when we look at all taxes that Texans pay, we're mainly a property tax state. Almost half of all taxes paid are actually property taxes. A big chunk of the rest you can see are sales taxes, both state and local. And of the property taxes, more than half goes to the schools, and then the other half is split pretty much evenly between cities, counties, and special districts like community colleges and hospital districts. So the reason I wanted to emphasize this is Senate Bill 2 by Senator Betancourt, among other things, would really limit the ability of local governments, other than school districts, to raise the revenue they need to support public services. And if you look at most city and county budgets, those public services are mainly public safety, fire, police, EMS, and for counties, courts and jails and things like that. So that's where they're putting the pressure on, making it harder for city councils and county commissioners, when really, if they're interested in cutting property taxes, they should look at school property taxes, which is more than half of the total. And the way to cut school property taxes is to increase state aid so school districts don't have to raise it themselves by raising their tax rates. So I may have taken a little more time than I needed, but I think it's important to understand what's behind the difficult choices that are going to be made in the budget. Now it's Eva's turn again, but I'll be happy to hang around when we're done to answer any more questions. Thanks.